Everyone noticed the luxury car sitting in the driveway. Almost nobody noticed the name that was written on the ownership papers. In the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek, Texas, a single moment was about to reveal how quickly people could judge a person without knowing the truth behind their story. The morning sun reflected across the polished surface of a silver Rolls-Royce parked outside an elegant home on a peaceful residential street. To most people passing by, it was simply a remarkable vehicle. But to one neighbor, the sight created a question that would soon change everything. Richard Whitmore had lived in Willow Creek for more than 20 years. He knew the streets, the families, and the routines of the neighborhood. He was respected by many residents and often considered himself someone who understood what belonged and what did not. That morning, as he looked out from his front window, he noticed a black woman standing beside the Rolls-Royce. Her name was Danielle Brooks. She appeared calm, professional, and completely comfortable standing next to the vehicle. She was not trying to attract attention. She was not making a scene. She was simply preparing for her day. But Richard did not see the full picture. He saw only a few details and quickly created a story in his mind. He wondered how someone like Danielle could be connected to such an expensive car. He did not know that Danielle was a successful corporate attorney who had spent years building her career through dedication and hard work. He did not know that the Rolls-Royce was not a mystery. It was hers. But the truth was still hidden from him. Imagine standing on that street and watching the scene unfold. You would see a luxury vehicle, a quiet neighborhood, and a woman standing beside a car that represented years of achievement. But you would also see something more important. You would see how powerful assumptions can become when people believe they already know the answer. Danielle noticed Richard watching from a distance, but she remained calm. She had experienced moments before where people made conclusions without asking questions. She understood that sometimes the greatest test of character was how someone treated others before learning their full story. She did not need to explain her success to anyone standing on the sidewalk. She knew who she was, and she knew the truth would eventually speak for itself. Richard, however, believed he was seeing something unusual. He believed he was protecting his neighborhood from something that did not belong. He did not realize that the only thing out of place was the assumption he had created. The Rolls-Royce was not the beginning of the story. It was only the detail that caught everyone's attention. The real story was about a woman whose achievements were invisible to strangers and a neighbor who was about to discover that appearances could never tell the complete truth. Because sometimes the person people question the most is the person who has the most to teach them. The fastest way to misunderstand someone is to believe you already know their story before hearing a single word from them. In Willow Creek, Texas, the quiet neighborhood continued its morning routine, but the conversation surrounding Danielle Brooks and the silver Rolls-Royce had already started spreading. A few neighbors stood outside their homes, exchanging opinions about what they had seen. They did not know Danielle. They did not know her career, her accomplishments, or the years of dedication that had brought her to that moment. They only knew what they thought they saw. Richard Whitmore listened as the discussion grew. His confidence increased because others seemed to share his assumptions. In his mind, the situation appeared simple. He believed the expensive vehicle belonged to someone else, and he believed he understood why Danielle was standing beside it. But the truth was much more complicated than the story people had created. Danielle remained calm throughout the morning. She noticed the looks and the quiet conversations, but she did not allow them to change her sense of dignity. She had learned throughout her life that people sometimes judged what they could see before taking the time to understand what they could not. She knew her achievements were real, even if strangers did not recognize them. Her success did not depend on approval from people who did not know her. Behind her calm expression was a lifetime of effort, education, and determination. She had built a respected career and worked hard to create the life she wanted. The Rolls-Royce was simply one detail of that journey. It was not the reason she deserved respect. It was only a symbol of what she had already accomplished. Across the street, Richard continued believing he was protecting the neighborhood. He saw himself as someone who was doing the responsible thing. But he never stopped to question why he reached his conclusion so quickly. He never asked himself why he believed the explanation he created before hearing Danielle's side of the story. That was the part of the situation he did not understand. The biggest issue was not the vehicle. It was the assumption attached to it. As the morning continued, Danielle decided not to argue. She knew that trying to convince people who had already made up their minds would not reveal the truth faster. She believed facts had a way of speaking louder than opinions. She simply remained patient and waited. Meanwhile, Richard made a decision that would bring the situation to a turning point. He believed he had enough information to take the next step. He believed the neighborhood needed answers. What he did not know was that the answer was already standing right in front of him. He did not know that the woman he questioned had nothing to prove. He did not know that the truth was not hidden because Danielle was hiding something. The truth was hidden because nobody had taken the time to ask. And sometimes, the most powerful moment is not when someone discovers a surprising fact. It is when they realize the mistake was never about what they saw. It was about what they assumed. The moment when assumptions become actions is often the moment when the truth begins to reveal itself. In Willow Creek, Texas, the peaceful neighborhood morning was slowly changing. What started as a simple misunderstanding about a luxury vehicle had become something much bigger. Richard Whitmore believed he was doing what was necessary, but he still did not understand that the situation was built on a conclusion he had created before knowing the facts. Danielle Brooks remained near her home, calm and composed, watching as the situation moved closer to a decision. She did not show anger. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited because she understood something important. The truth does not need to compete with assumptions. It only needs the right moment to be seen. Richard walked back toward his home feeling confident. In his mind, he believed he had noticed something others had overlooked. He believed his experience as a longtime resident gave him the ability to recognize what belonged in the neighborhood and what did not. But he never stopped to ask himself a deeper question. What if the thing he believed was obvious was actually something he misunderstood? Danielle had spent years learning that people often reveal more about themselves through their reactions than through their words. She knew that a person's first response could come from personal experiences, expectations, or ideas they had carried for years. That did not mean people could not change. It meant they needed the opportunity to see a situation differently. As she stood beside the Rolls-Royce, Danielle thought about all the moments that had brought her there. She remembered the long hours of work, the challenges she had overcome, and the determination required to build her career. The vehicle represented a personal achievement, but it did not define her. She was not valuable because she owned something expensive. She was valuable because of who she was. Richard, however, focused only on the object in front of him. The Rolls-Royce became the center of his attention, and he forgot that a person was standing beside it. That was the mistake hidden beneath the entire situation. The car was visible. Danielle's story was not. Eventually, Richard decided to contact the local authorities because he believed the situation needed to be addressed. He explained what he thought had happened, unaware that his version of events was missing the most important piece of information. He did not know Danielle was the rightful owner. He did not know that the person he questioned had every reason to be there. He did not know that the answer he was searching for was already written in documents that could change everything. When Officer Michael Reynolds received the call, he expected to handle a routine neighborhood concern. He had no idea that the situation waiting for him would become a lesson about assumptions, fairness, and the importance of listening before reaching conclusions. As the officer made his way toward Willow Creek, Danielle remained calm because she knew the truth was on her side. She did not need to create a dramatic moment. She did not need to convince everyone through emotion. She simply needed the facts to be heard. And soon, everyone would discover that the biggest misunderstanding was never about the Rolls-Royce. It was about the story people created before they knew the truth. The arrival of an unexpected visitor can reveal the difference between a quick judgment and a careful understanding. In Willow Creek, Texas, Officer Michael Reynolds drove through the quiet neighborhood, unaware that a simple call about a luxury vehicle would soon become a powerful reminder about fairness and the importance of seeing the complete picture. When he arrived, He saw Richard Whitmore standing nearby and Danielle Brooks calmly waiting beside the silver Rolls-Royce. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary neighborhood concern. A resident had reported something unusual, and an officer had arrived to ask questions. But Michael knew from experience that every situation had more than one side. Before making any conclusions, he needed to understand the facts. Richard approached with confidence. He explained what he had seen and shared the concerns that led him to make the call. He described the vehicle, the location, and the situation as he understood it. But there was one important thing missing from his explanation. He had never asked Danielle who she was. He had never asked about her connection to the vehicle. He had never considered that the answer might be different from the story he created in his mind. Danielle listened quietly as Richard spoke. She did not interrupt him. She did not try to turn the moment into an argument. Instead, she allowed the questions to be asked because she knew the truth was simple. She knew the facts would speak for themselves. Officer Reynolds noticed something unusual about the interaction. He saw that Danielle was not acting defensive or uncertain. She was calm because she understood something others did not. She was not trying to prove her worth. She was simply waiting for the truth to be recognized. Michael politely asked Danielle about the Rolls-Royce and requested information that could clarify the situation. Danielle nodded and explained that she understood why he needed to ask. She respected the process, but she also understood the importance of being treated fairly during that process. She reached for a folder containing documents connected to the vehicle. Richard watched closely, still believing the answer would confirm his assumptions. He expected an explanation that supported his concerns. He did not expect the moment that was about to happen. As Danielle opened the folder, the atmosphere around the driveway changed. The neighbors who had been quietly watching became more attentive. The conversation was no longer about what people believed they saw. It was about what the facts would reveal. Michael looked at the documents carefully, knowing that a piece of paper could completely change the understanding of a situation. Richard remained silent, waiting for confirmation that he had been right. But the truth was moving closer, and it was not the truth he expected. The important question was no longer whether Danielle belonged beside the vehicle. The important question was why so many people had believed she did not belong there in the first place. And as the ownership documents came into view, everyone standing on that quiet street was about to learn that the truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, written clearly on a page that changes everything. The truth is often the simplest thing in the room, but people sometimes spend the most time looking everywhere except where the answer is waiting. In the quiet driveway of Willow Creek, Texas, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Officer Michael Reynolds carefully reviewed the documents Danielle Brooks had provided, while Richard Whitmore stood nearby, still expecting the explanation he believed would confirm his concerns. But within seconds, the entire situation began to change. The paperwork showed exactly what Danielle had known from the beginning. The silver Rolls-Royce was legally registered to her. The name on the documents belonged to the woman standing beside the vehicle. There was no mystery. There was no misunderstanding about ownership. The truth was clear. For a moment, nobody spoke. The neighbors who had been watching from a distance became quiet. The assumptions that had filled the morning disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable realization. The story people created was never based on facts. It was based on what they thought they saw. Richard looked at Danielle differently now. The confidence he carried earlier began to fade as he understood that he had been wrong about the situation. The person he believed needed to explain herself was actually the person who had been telling the truth all along. Danielle did not celebrate the moment. She did not use the truth as a reason to embarrass anyone. She simply closed the folder and remained calm. That reaction surprised many people more than the documents themselves. She had every reason to be frustrated, but she chose patience instead. She understood that proving a fact was not the same as creating understanding. Officer Reynolds also recognized that the moment represented something bigger than a simple ownership question. The paperwork had answered who owned the vehicle, but it also revealed a deeper issue. How quickly had people decided what was possible for someone they did not know? How quickly had they created a story without asking for the real one? Michael looked at Danielle with respect and acknowledged that the situation had been misunderstood from the beginning. He appreciated the way she handled the conversation with professionalism and composure. Danielle accepted his words, but she also understood that moments like this were not only about one person apologizing. They were about learning how assumptions can affect the way people are treated. Richard finally faced the reality of his mistake. He realized that the expensive vehicle was never the important part of the story. The important part was the person standing beside it. He had focused on the object and ignored the individual. He had noticed the car before noticing the person. And now the truth had shown him what he failed to see. Danielle had not needed the Rolls-Royce to prove her value. She had already earned everything through years of dedication and hard work. The documents only confirmed ownership of a vehicle. They did not define her success, her character, or her worth. As the neighbors slowly returned to their homes, the driveway became quiet again. But the lesson remained. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are not about finding something hidden. Sometimes they are about realizing what was visible all along. The truth had been there from the beginning. People simply needed to be willing to see it. The truth had finally been revealed, but the most important part of the moment was not the document that proved ownership. It was what happened after everyone understood they had been wrong. In the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek, Texas, the driveway that had once been filled with assumptions was now filled with reflection. Officer Michael Reynolds stood beside Danielle Brooks and Richard Whitmore, recognizing that the situation had become about much more than a luxury vehicle. It had become a reminder of how quickly people can create a story about someone they do not know. Danielle carefully placed the ownership papers back into her folder. She did not look for an apology filled with excuses. She did not ask anyone to feel embarrassed. Instead, she simply hoped people would take a moment to think about what had happened. She knew that the most valuable lesson was not that she owned a Rolls-Royce. The valuable lesson was that nobody should have to prove their worth before receiving basic respect. Richard remained quiet as he processed the situation. Earlier that morning, he believed he was protecting his neighborhood. Now he understood that his confidence had come from an incomplete picture. He had trusted his assumption more than he trusted the possibility that there was another explanation. That realization was difficult because it forced him to look beyond the vehicle and look at his own reaction. He thought about the moment he first saw Danielle standing beside the car. He remembered the conclusion he immediately reached. Then he realized the truth had been right in front of him the entire time. The problem was not that he lacked information. The problem was that he never searched for it before making a judgment. Officer Reynolds also reflected on the encounter. In his years of service, he had learned that every call carried a human story behind it. A report might contain details, but it could never fully describe the people involved. He understood that his responsibility was not only to respond quickly. It was also to listen carefully and remain fair when the situation was not as simple as it first appeared. Danielle appreciated the way Michael handled the conversation. She knew that his willingness to ask questions and review the facts mattered. Real fairness did not mean assuming everyone was right. It meant creating space for the truth to be discovered. As the neighbors watched from their homes, many of them began to see the situation differently. They had witnessed something more meaningful than a misunderstanding about a vehicle. They had witnessed the difference between an assumption and reality. They had seen how patience and dignity could change the direction of a difficult moment. Danielle eventually prepared to leave, continuing with the day she had planned before any of this happened. The Rolls-Royce remained just a car. It was impressive, but it was not the reason her story mattered. Her story mattered because she had faced a moment where others questioned her without knowing her. And she responded with confidence, patience, and truth. Richard watched her leave and understood something he would remember for a long time. The greatest mistake was not failing to recognize the value of the vehicle. The greatest mistake was failing to recognize the value of the person standing beside it. The most meaningful changes do not always happen in front of a crowd. Sometimes they happen quietly, in the thoughts people carry with them after a moment that challenges everything they believed before. In Willow Creek, Texas, The events surrounding Danielle Brooks, Richard Whitmore, and Officer Michael Reynolds continued to stay in the minds of everyone who witnessed what happened. The Rolls-Royce was no longer the center of attention. The real focus had become the lesson hidden behind the misunderstanding. Richard spent the following days thinking about that morning. He replayed the moment he first looked outside and saw Danielle standing beside the vehicle. He remembered how quickly he created a story without knowing the person in front of him. That was the part that stayed with him the most. He realized he had not been reacting to facts. He had been reacting to an assumption. For someone who believed he understood his neighborhood, that realization was uncomfortable. But it was also important. Richard began to understand that growth did not come from proving he had always been right. Growth came from accepting the moments when he had been wrong. Danielle, meanwhile, continued her daily life. She returned to her work, her responsibilities, and the goals she had spent years building. The incident did not define her because she had never allowed other people's opinions to determine her value. She knew that success was not measured by a vehicle, a title, or the way strangers viewed her. It was measured by the dedication and character she carried every day. Officer Michael Reynolds also thought about the encounter. He recognized that his role required more than responding to situations. It required understanding the people involved. The experience reminded him that every person had a story beyond what could be seen in a brief interaction. A person's appearance, possessions, or circumstances could never reveal the complete truth about who they were. The lesson from Willow Creek reached beyond one driveway. It became a reminder that fairness begins before the facts are revealed. It begins with the willingness to ask questions, listen carefully, and avoid creating conclusions before understanding the full picture. Richard eventually found an opportunity to speak with Danielle. He did not approach her with excuses or attempts to erase what happened. Instead, he approached her with honesty. He acknowledged that he had been too quick to judge and that he should have taken the time to understand before making assumptions. Danielle listened calmly. She appreciated that he was willing to reflect because she knew change required more than recognizing a mistake. It required learning from it. Their conversation did not erase the moment, but it transformed the meaning of it. What began as a situation built on misunderstanding became an opportunity for awareness. The neighborhood that once focused on a luxury vehicle began to remember something much more important. They remembered the importance of seeing people before judging them. They remembered that every person carries experiences, achievements, and struggles that are invisible to strangers. And they remembered that the truth does not need to prove itself through anger. Sometimes, the strongest response is simply allowing the truth to stand with dignity and patience. The most powerful lessons are often the ones that continue changing people long after the moment has passed. In Willow Creek, Texas, the morning when Danielle Brooks stood beside the silver Rolls-Royce was no longer remembered as a misunderstanding. It became a reminder of how important it is to look beyond appearances and understand the person behind the situation. The neighborhood had returned to its normal routine, but the memory of that day remained with many people. Richard Whitmore especially found himself seeing familiar streets in a different way. For years, he believed he understood the community around him. He believed experience gave him the ability to recognize what was normal and what was unusual. But after meeting Danielle, he realized that experience without understanding could still lead to the wrong conclusion. He began paying closer attention to the small moments when people make assumptions about others. He learned that a first impression is only a beginning, not the entire story. Danielle never wanted the situation to become a public lesson about her. She never wanted attention because of what she owned or what she had achieved. What mattered to her was the message behind the moment. She believed that every person deserved to be approached with respect before their background, career, or accomplishments were known. A person should not have to reveal their success before being treated fairly. That belief was something she carried with her throughout her life. Officer Michael Reynolds also carried the experience forward. As someone responsible for serving the community, he understood that every interaction had the potential to influence how people felt about fairness and trust. The encounter reminded him that listening was just as important as responding. Facts mattered, but so did the way people were treated while those facts were being discovered. He knew that trust was built through patience, professionalism, and the willingness to see every person as an individual. The story of Danielle and the Rolls-Royce slowly became a quiet reminder throughout Willow Creek. People began thinking about how often they judged situations before understanding them. They began asking themselves whether they were seeing the complete picture or only the part that was easiest to notice. The vehicle had been the detail that attracted attention, but the real lesson had nothing to do with luxury. It was about dignity. It was about recognizing that someone's value cannot be measured by what others assume about them. Richard eventually understood that the most important thing he gained from the experience was not an apology to offer, but a perspective to carry. He learned that being a good neighbor was not about deciding who belonged. It was about making sure everyone had the opportunity to be understood. Danielle continued moving forward with the same confidence she had shown from the beginning. She did not need the moment to define her because she already knew her own worth. The truth had never been hidden because she lacked confidence. The truth had simply been waiting for people to slow down and listen. And in the end, that was the lesson Willow Creek remembered most. People are often more than what others expect them to be, and true fairness begins when we choose to discover the story before creating one. The most lasting changes are not always created by dramatic moments. Sometimes they begin with a simple realization that stays with people long after the day is over. In Willow Creek, Texas, the story of Danielle Brooks, Richard Whitmore, and Officer Michael Reynolds became one of those moments. It was never truly about a silver Rolls-Royce sitting in a driveway. It was about the invisible stories people carry and the importance of understanding someone before deciding who they are. Weeks after the encounter, Richard continued to think about what happened. He no longer saw that morning as just a misunderstanding. He saw it as a reminder that even people with years of experience can still learn something new about themselves. He had spent many years believing he knew his neighborhood well, but he discovered that knowing a place does not always mean knowing the people inside it. Every person has a history, a journey, and a reason for standing where they stand. Richard understood that the moment he looked at Danielle, he had focused on what was easiest to notice instead of what was most important to understand. Danielle's calm response became the part of the story that people remembered most. She could have allowed frustration to control the moment, but she chose patience. She could have focused on proving others wrong, but she focused on allowing the truth to be seen. Her strength came from knowing that her identity was not created by someone else's opinion. She knew her achievements, her values, and her character existed long before anyone recognized them. Officer Michael Reynolds continued serving the community with a renewed perspective. The encounter reminded him that every situation required more than simply finding an answer. It required understanding the people involved. He believed that fairness was not only about following procedures. It was also about making sure people were treated with respect while those procedures were carried out. The experience encouraged him to continue approaching every interaction with patience and an open mind. In the months that followed, the neighborhood of Willow Creek slowly changed. People became more aware of the importance of asking questions before reaching conclusions. They began to understand that a person's appearance, possessions, or circumstances could never reveal the full story of who they were. The lesson spread quietly, not through a public announcement, but through conversations between neighbors who remembered what they had witnessed. Richard eventually realized that the greatest thing he gained from the experience was not simply recognizing Danielle's ownership of a vehicle. The greater lesson was recognizing her humanity before knowing anything else about her. Danielle never needed a luxury car to prove she belonged. She belonged because every person deserves respect. The documents confirmed ownership, but her dignity had been clear from the beginning. The truth had always been present. It was simply waiting for people to look beyond their first assumptions. And that became the message Willow Creek carried forward. A person's worth is never determined by what others expect to see. True understanding begins when people choose to discover the story before creating one.